Welcome to Aston Villa Through the Years with Colin Abbott, talking about his new book, SRB.
Mr. Colin Abbott, welcome to our football book podcast, mate. Author of the week, no less than.
Thank you very much.
And when I say author of the week, of course, I mean author of the month. But Andy has moved, and it's been a couple of months since we've done the last hour, and it is now our football book podcast.
Yeah.
It's rather a mouthful, but I did want to get you on as author of the month because I'm a big fan of yours. When we first hooked up, it was over your Aston Villa, the first 150 years with John Farrelly and John Russell. Absolute coffee table, magnificent book. We're not going to talk about that because we have done a podcast already about that. We will again reconvene in, I think it's 2024, isn't it? When the second part
Paul, yeah.
of that comes out. You've done another wonderful, the big Aston Villa book of the 70s, again with Legends Publishing. David Lane, an absolute legend. And
Yes.
the latest book that you're working on is a very similar book. It's the big Aston Villa book, but it's not the 70s, it's the 80s. We've just referenced Dennis Mortimer's book, The Full Morty, which Dennis has done the foreword of your book. So let's just talk about, firstly, the 80s, because it was a great decade for Villa, or the first part of it was a great decade for Villa, and then we'll talk about your Bartons Army book as well, sir.
No problem at all, Paul.
So you
No
fire
problem at all.
away. How long has it taken? I mean, I know you, and your research is second to none, and it is a labour of love. So how long has it taken you? And when did you start doing this concept? Because you've had it on the back burner for some time, haven't you?
We have. We had to keep shelving it to go on to other projects, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah.
When the 70s come out, we had a book launch at Villa Park in November 16. But as soon as Dave formatted the book and it was sort of signed off and went to the printers, I actually started on the 80s book back then.
Yeah.
And I started doing match reports because, bearing in mind, there's about 500 to do over the course of a season. I started in earnest once the 70s went to print. So I probably started that about September, October 16, and it's finally there 6 years down the line. But I've got to say, we put that one on the back burner twice. Once to do the one that you mentioned, the 150 years. And then once that had been completed, we came back to the 80s book. But then what with all the hype of the celebrations for the 40th anniversary of the lads winning the European Cup, I wanted to do something, and Dave Lane come up with this fantastic concept. So we got Bartons Army out the way, and then we restarted for the third time with the 80s, and it has only just this week been, as I would say, signed off. It's remaining open till Sunday for fans to get the names in, and then first thing Monday or Tuesday, it's off to be printed, and that's the latest project, and it's reached completion, and it's I was pleased with the 70s one, but this one, it knocked spots off it simply because of what we achieved.
Yeah. We
started the season with a bang, winning the title. We'd been threatening in 76 to 7. I actually think, and I've spoken to Dennis Mortimer about this. I actually thought we were going to win the treble, you know.
Yeah, Dennis was thinking along those same lines, and he was quite. I'm reading Dennis's book at the moment. He was quite disappointed when Villa didn't win the treble because they could have, and they were a Nats whisker, wasn't they, away from it?
Yeah, well, when you consider I think it was 14 cup matches that season. That's a third of what the league was back in the day when it was 42 games.
Yes.
We had. Every time the Villa turned up at the baseball ground, you could guarantee there was injuries. Chris Nichol was injured. Andy Gray was injured. Frank Carradus was injured. Chris Nichol only played in the cup final because they strapped his foot up that tight. He said it was like when he hit that ball from 35 yards out, he said it was like hitting it with an iron, playing golf. That ball was going nowhere other than in the net.
Yeah.
And those injuries cost us I think we finished 6 points behind Liverpool that season when we finished fourth.
Yeah, you did.
There wasn't a lot in it. And you think of the games that we could have won, but that was I suppose that was like a prelude to what was on the horizon. Saunders was tweaking here and there. You know, it's everybody goes on about the final piece of the jigsaw. Don't mention the other 10 pieces of the jigsaw prior, but I can see his analogy in that. And the players all said that from the Leeds game onwards. I was at a gig in the week there. Jimmy Rimmer, he said he knew it was on the boil. Dennis knew that they were going to do it from the very first league game at Leeds. So this 80s book, to start the decade, I should say, sorry, with winning the title. And when you think about it, 89 to 90, we were so close to winning that again.
Yeah.
So there was a downside through the middle of the decade. We never got close really to what we achieved in that first year. The second season, you know, we finished 11th. That was pretty rough. Bearing in mind Ipswich Town, who they pushed us all the way in 80 to 81. They actually finished runners up in 81 to 2.
Yeah, they did it twice, didn't they? Yeah.
That's consistency.
Yeah.
But like I say, we fell away to 11th, but I defy any team to say that they wouldn't finish 11th if they got the European Cup in their hands. It was a no-brainer, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and an unbelievable situation happened in February that year when Ron Saunders resigned, walked out, then went to Birmingham City. Tony Barton took over. Villa were 15th at the time and did end up 11th, so there was a little bit of progression. Tony didn't really tinker much with the team. He had that many great professionals that done it for him, didn't he?
Paul.
Absolutely.
Tony didn't need to, because with doing this book and doing the Bartons Army book, I was really fortunate to get close to Tony Barton's family, be it Chris and Gary, his sons, or Tony's widow, Rosina. Yeah. And where everybody assumed, I certainly assumed, that Tony Barton was Ron Saunders' assistant manager.
Yeah, he was chief scout, wasn't
he? He came in as a scout, but his actual title, believe it or not, was manager's assistant.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll tell you what, assistant manager and manager's assistant, it's like the difference between night and day.
Right, okay.
But you said Tony didn't tinker with anything. Tony didn't need to. He knew exactly what he had there because, and again, I only found out through the research, from Ron Saunders coming in at Villa Park. Well, Keith Leonard got injured early 75 as it happens, in an injury against Jimmy Rimmer.
Yeah.
The Villa needed to replace Keith Leonard. They needed a forward. Tony Barton, who was at Portsmouth at the time, had earmarked a young Scottish lad no one had heard of called Andy Gray.
Yeah.
He was in the employ of Portsmouth. Portsmouth didn't want him because he wasn't a name to put bums on seats. Tony got in touch with Ron Saunders, who they'd played together at Fratton Park. Ron was sold on the idea, got Andy Gray in, and as a result of that, he offered Tony the job of chief scout. Yeah. Tony relocated with his family up to Birmingham from Portsmouth. His first signing was the first person Tony actually recommended to Ron was Dennis Mortimer, believe it or not.
Right.
And every single player, and I have this on good authority, I actually spoke to Tony's personal assistant, Tony Barton's personal assistant, just to get clarity on it. But every single player that came in, from Dennis Mortimer all the way through to when Tony Barton was actually sacked, the only player that came through the door where Tony had nothing to do with it was actually David Geddes.
Yeah.
You think of all the other players that came in, you got your Kenny Swains and your Des Bremners and your Peter Withs and your Tony Morleys, Ken McNaught, Tony Barton. Tony Barton was with the eyes that found those. It's incredible.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, because I've been to quite a few of the events commemorating Villa's successes of winning both the league and then the European Cup, and to a man, every player has sung the praises of Tony Barton. And when Andy
Yeah,
Blair has said, "Well, how did you come to Villa Park?" It's, "Well, Tony Barton." How did you? Tony Barton. Tony
yeah.
Barton was so instrumental in the development, because behind that manager needs a team, and Saunders got a great team. And when you look at the 80s team that went on and won the league and the European Cup, that 70s team, he built that in the image of the 70s team, didn't he?
Of
Where
course he
you
did.
could look at Gray and Little, and then you could look at Shaw and With. Either one could play with the other. For instance, Peter With could have played with Brian Little, and Peter was brought in really to play with
That's
Brian.
right.
He had
That
that problem as well with injuries, didn't he? So what he
yeah.
done was quite remarkable.
Andy Gray, he was, I know he wasn't he wasn't in the same physique and the same mould as Peter With, but Andy put himself about. And I think he was 5'10", but bloody hell, he could jump.
Yeah, he could.
He could jump. The goals he scored with his head were no one's business. And Brian fed off him. You had John Dean, that was prolific at scoring. They moved on, and then Peter With was the target man, much as Andy Lockhead had been back in the 70s. And then you had a young Gary Shaw feeding off Peter.
Yeah.
So it was a progression. And had Alex Cropley not got injured, Alex Cropley would have carried on to be in the team that won the title.
Yeah,
he got injured. Des Bremner was his replacement, a very, very similar middle of the park player. And Des Bremner, he never really got the credit or the plaudits that the bloke deserved. He was never going to be a match winner. He wasn't blonde haired, and he wasn't like a Gary Shaw pin-up type thing, where Gary would get 10 out of 10 some weeks, and he might go down a bit. Whereas with Des Bremner, he was a constant. He'd have been a number 8 out of 10 every game of the season. Never put a foot wrong. Never sort of caught the eye, but he did a job.
Absolutely. He was a steady Eddie. He was Mr. Consistency, Mr. Reliability.
Exactly.
And as you say, I mean, another player that they got from Scotland, there was a big Scottish contingent during the 70s and the 80s, wasn't there? And Andy,
That's right.
I remember doing an interview with Andy, a podcast with Andy, and he said Ron hadn't seen me play football. Andy didn't even know where Aston Villa was. But,
no, that's right.
He come down there, and I think the first taste of Aston Villa and Villa Park was when Villa put Birmingham City to the sword, and Brian scored the winning goal, wasn't he? He was there on the bench and thought, "Blimey!"
Andy was in the dugout, like you said.
Yeah.
He wanted a piece of it.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And he's like, "Blimey!" I mean, this is a big club. I think at Dundee United, where he previously played, I think they used to get probably 12, 15, 18,000 maximum. This was a different ball game for Andy Gray.
Of course it was. What I would say in Ron's defence, I'm waxing lyrical about Tony Barton for bringing all these players in.
Yeah.
But what you got to think of, when Tony went up to Dunfermline and watched Alan Evans, Alan was a forward.
Yeah, he was.
And when Kenny Swain came down to Villa Park, Kenny was a forward.
Yeah,
he was like a right-sided, like your old outside right.
Yeah.
Your number 7. And then Gary Williams, he started off as a centre-half initially.
Yeah.
And then he found these places and he changed them around. He took Alan Evans from a centre-forward role, stuck him alongside a fellow Scott Ken McNaught, and wow, one of the best half-back pairings you would see until Paul McGrath come on the scene.
But again,
further down the line, and then Kenny Swain. Kenny was an attacking fullback, and Kenny told me once that Ron Saunders had said to him, "I want you to defend on their 18-yard line," and that just speaks volumes.
Yeah.
He did not want his side defending deep. He wanted them to be on the offensive all the time.
Absolutely.
And that was the mark of Saunders.
Absolutely, but when you'd identified the central defensive partnership there, the team before it, you'd got an overlapping right full back in John Gidman, hadn't you? You
Well,
know,
that's right. Kenny Swain basically took the place of Gidman.
exactly, yeah. And then you
Yeah,
look at Chris Nicol, and McNaught took the place of Nicol. Alan
and
Evans took the place of Leighton Phillips.
that's
So
right.
all of these players, he identified the players to replace and brought them in, and the transition was almost seamless, wasn't it? And
Yeah,
let's
and
not forget in the 70s, Dixie Dean, because Dixie was a great forward
he
who
was
scored a lot
phenomenal.
of goals, didn't he, in that one season?
That's right. That's right. He was very unfortunate, Dixie, because he was sort of pushed out to West Bromwich Albion.
Yeah.
But Saunders, he swapped players like for like. I never thought John Gidman would be replaced, but he was.
Yeah.
And I've actually read Dennis's book, The Full Morty. Absolutely, it's a riveting read. I actually thought, through my conversations with Dennis, he's put the forward down for this 80s book. He's been one of 7 players interviewed for this 80s book. When I say interviewed, there's like a 4 or 5 page spread on 7 players.
Yeah.
Dennis was gracious enough to be one of those. And when he talks, you listen, and everything he says just makes sense. And he gives you such a beautiful, wonderful insight into the workings of that team that was so achieving,
You can certainly see why Dennis was the captain, because he's a great talker, a great inspiration, a
Oh,
great
absolutely,
leader.
absolutely brilliant bloke. Even, I'll stand and I'll stand and talk to him, and that you're in the presence of someone special. You just do.
Absolutely.
You can't not be.
Who was the other players that you interviewed for your Aston Villa? Your
Um,
big. It's called the Big Aston Villa Book of the 80s. So it just sits alongside the
it
70s
is.
book, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's right. Well, we've been really, really fortunate with the people that we've got on board. Gary Thompson, bearing in mind these interviews took place probably 2 years ago. Gary Thompson, who, wow, I remember watching him in that 87 to 88 season when Graham Taylor got us up.
Yeah.
And the Villa fans used to sing Bruno. He was built like the
Yeah, he was.
proverbial.
Again, come from Coventry, didn't he?
Yeah, he was absolutely phenomenal. Well, he did play for Coventry. He came to us from Sheffield Wednesday.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, he was playing for Sheffield Wednesday the year we got relegated. His boss was Howard Wilkinson.
Got ya.
And as he come off the pitch, Ron Wiley, another Villa legend, had said to Tomo, "Would you like to come to Villa Park?" And Gary said, "I'd walk there to come to Villa."
Yeah.
Howard Wilkinson saw him talking to the enemy, and he cussed him. But Gary Thompson, he gave us a really, really lovely in-depth interview, and yet you've got to remember he was in the process, like Dennis, of doing his own book. It's Don't Believe a Word. I've got a copy of that. I haven't had time to go through it as in depth as I want to because I've got my own stuff going on. But Gary says it. He tells it exactly as it is. Warts and all. And he was a phenomenal player. Nobody can forget those 2 goals he scored at Birmingham City when we beat them 2-1 on the way to coming up with Taylor. He scored a lot of goals for us that year, Gary Thompson. He was one of them. Dennis Mortimer was another one of the 7 as mentioned. I got Nigel Spink involved. He tells a lovely story. I wasn't aware that he played for West Ham as a kid, and he let a chunk of goals in. It was either Martin Chivers or Jimmy. I think it was Martin Chivers scored 4 past him, and he was called into the West Ham office, and the hierarchy there with John Lyle and Ron Greenwood, and he basically told him not to give him his job on the building site. And yet, look what he aspired to. He's done something that West Ham have never done. They haven't won the European Cup. So Nigel was one. Kevin Gage, he started off at Wimbledon. Kevin, fantastic player for us. He started as a right back, then he was a He was a probing midfield player. He weighed in with goals. Proper no nonsense. Well, never mind no nonsense. I think Gagey was a bit of a flair player. I remember him scoring a couple when Norwich City were actually top of the table. We beat Norwich 3-1.
Yeah.
And Kevin Gage scored 2 of the goals, and he was on fire that season. Very, very reliable player. We have Mark Burke. Mark didn't make a great deal of appearances for us, but he did a job for us when he was called upon. Unfortunately, he followed. There was like an exodus from Villa Park that went to Ayresome Park, Middlesbrough.
Yeah.
Bruce Rioch was the manager up there. They got the likes of the goalkeeper, Kevin Poole. They got Paul Kerr. Mark Burke went up there. There's a few more went up. I can't remember offhand who they were. But Mark's another one that was interviewed. And, you know, he might not have played as many games or was as prominent as the lads we've mentioned, but he still played a role. Then we have Andy Gray, the lad that came from Crystal Palace, not the Scottish one.
Yeah.
Andy was a fantastic player. I saw him get sent off in a couple of games, but he wore his heart on his sleeve, Andy. And I've been talking to him recently, funny enough. Back in the day when I lived in the Northeast, there were some games I just could not get tickets for, one being Luton away, you know, and it was members only.
Yeah.
And Andy Gray I caught him the one day, but Middlesbrough coming out the ground at Middlesbrough after a 3-3 draw. And I was asking a few players if he could help us get a ticket for Luton. And Andy said, yeah, I'll get you one. And I said, you're not pulling me chain because it's a long way to go down to Luton from the northeast. And he said, no, I'll have a ticket. And he did. And he helped us get tickets for that famous Crewe Alexander game when we were trailing 2-0 at half time. I was in the seats for that through tickets that Andy got me. Yeah. I was ending up sitting next to this young girl who turned out to be David Platt's future wife.
Right.
At half time, I went round the back of that stand just to stretch my legs, and I actually listened. I could hear through this glass. I could hear Graham Taylor reading the players the riot act, and I didn't actually think Graham Taylor swore till then. And sort of wow. So, yeah. And then the last player that we've got for this book, and I don't know how to this day how I managed to get him to agree, but I actually interviewed David Platt
Probably his bird.
quite a few hours. Well, funny enough, I told him the story when I was interviewing him last year on the phone. I told him this story about how I'd been sat next to this girl, Rachel, and she said to me, she says, "Oh, how's David Platt doing?" I said, "Oh, he's playing brilliant." I said, he scored 4 goals against Ipswich in a cup match a few weeks ago. And she says, "Yes, I've got the match ball." And I turned to my mate, and there was a few expletives among it, but I'd basically said, I wouldn't be giving my girlfriend the match ball. And after that, she didn't speak to me. And I reminded David of that. He says, when he gets off the phone, he's going to go and mention this to her. But David, the superstar that he was, the story that he tells me, it was quite surreal, actually, because he's telling me how he come down to Villa from Crewe Alexander. He'd gladly left Old Trafford because he wasn't getting first team time. He comes to Villa, finds himself in the reserves. He's not even training with the first team, and he's going back to a hotel. He's sitting there watching 4 walls, thinking, "I've made a mistake here. I've taken a backward turn because I am no longer a first team player." And you think, he's telling you this, and then you straight away you think of David Platt. You think of that wonderful goal he scored against Belgium.
Oh, yes.
And then this same lad's telling you how he thought he made a mistake because he'd come to Aston Villa. It's like, wow.
It is crazy, isn't it? The way that the players have had times in their career where they just thought, wow, what am I doing? But then, the way that they progress and their path, if you like, opens up for them, and they just turn into this magnificent player.
Yeah.
And what a player he was at Villa Park, wasn't he, Plato?
Well, I was talking to him on the phone, and I did say the name Gordon Cowans came up, and David Platt said, honestly, he absolutely loves Sid.
Yeah.
And it's the first time I've ever given a player's number over without asking their permission. But after I got off the phone to David, David was aware that Sid's got a few problems where his memory's concerned. And I phoned Sid and I said, I've just been having a wonderful conversation with Platty. Here's his number. Give him a ring, Sid. And he did.
Yeah, great.
And that would have helped him enormously. And the love that they have for each other, without that sounding weird.
Yeah.
David would say he mentioned in one, it's mentioned in the book, so I don't want to go too deep, but when we were playing Inter Milan at home, David scored the second goal. Kent Nielsen scored an absolute thunderbolt. The second one, David Platt, as soon as the ball was pushed to Cascarino, Platt made his run. He said, I knew Cascarino wouldn't find me. He says, but I knew Cascarino would just push the ball short to Sid Cowans. Yeah. And he says, it doesn't matter where I'm at. He says, Sid will find me, whether it's with his left foot or his right foot. He will put that ball exactly where he knows I need it. And lo and behold, he does. Sid's, both of Sid's feet, it was like a wand what he could do with that ball.
Absolutely.
Absolute. And him, Sid and Platt, they must be two of the closest players to being classed as world class that I've had the fortune to watch at the Villa. The only player I would actually put above those in my 50 years watching them would be Paul McGrath.
Yeah.
He was just, I can't even put words in that. He was just out of this world, Paul McGrath.
Absolutely.
And when I say world class, Paul, what I mean is I think Paul McGrath would have walked into any club side in the world at that time on his form.
Absolutely. I remember talking to Big Ron, and when they used to play Manchester United, used to play against Liverpool. Rushy never scored against Man United, and Paul McGrath, in his unassuming manner, used to say, "Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. Thank you very much, Mr. Rush." And again, you really used to piss and Rush off, that did.
Yeah.
But that was Paul McGrath. What a player.
Yeah.
I can see a 90s book on the horizon. But we must talk finally about Bartons Army. Different because the 80s, 70s and the 80s, match reports talking to players, it's got everything about Aston Villa of the 70s and the 80s. Bartons Army is pretty much an account of the supporters, isn't it? I was just looking through.
Totally different concept, Paul.
Yeah, Richard Sydenham is in here, I noticed, and Terry Whelan's in there. So a few of my Facebook friends are in there. There's some wonderful pictures of Villa supporters lying down in a state of, worse for wear, shall we say. But there's some big accounts, and some of them, Keith Foreman here, I'm looking here on page 212, probably just a couple of paragraphs. So you've had so many, and some have got a lot to say, and some haven't got quite a lot to say, but all of them in this wonderful book, and great accounts of their memories of...
They're so diverse, every one of them. I'll be honest with you, it was Dave Lane's idea, this. Yeah. He knew I went to the final. He knew I missed I spent a whole year at Agricultural College living on a farm management course. And I took the time off at the very end to go to Rotterdam to watch the Villa in that final. Yes. And I wasn't allowed to sit my exams that I missed through going to Rotterdam.
Blimey.
And the principal there, he really wasn't impressed. But he wasn't a football fan. He liked horses. And I actually said to him as I came out the office, he sort of berated me like a child. And I said, it's not my fault. I said, you're only interested in things that eat hay and fart. And it didn't go down very well. But I never went back anyway, so it didn't make a great deal of difference.
I love the colour. Sorry to butt in here, but I love the cover. It's a play on Dad's Army, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bartons Army. It's fantastic.
Well, I can't take the credit for that. It was David Lane's. It was David Lane's idea.
Yeah,
The
brilliant.
cover was his idea. All I did, I put my words in it, my journey through all the. Even though I only went to the final, I was telling my story of what I was doing and where I was at through all the rounds, because I was as big an anorak then as I am now, unfortunately. And the nice thing about this was, when Dave suggested it, I wasn't really that keen, to be honest. I was a bit lukewarm, because I know somebody who did a book. He basically got all the fans' memories and stuck them in a book, but he didn't edit them. He didn't change any grammatical errors, so he made a lot of people look a bit stupid.
Yeah, got ya.
And that's what was in my mind, and I thought, no, I'm not going down this route.
Mm.
And Dave Lane said, look, lots of people know you. You know loads of people. Just put it out there. I fired the idea off to a dozen people. They all come back saying how fantastic it was, and it was born. And I'll tell you what, it gathered pace. It gathered quicker than what Tony Morley could move.
And that was
It
fast.
was mad.
I'm looking through Graham Denton as well, who wrote the book about Ron Saunders.
Yeah.
He's got an account in there, hasn't
Yes.
he?
We've actually got Dean. We've got Dean Smith, our
Yes.
old leader.
I noticed that. Turnstiles
Dino.
got a piece in there as well, hasn't
Yeah.
he?
I'll tell you what. Can you remember the lad who wrote "We're All Going to Rotterdam"? You know that 1982 ditty that Mervyn King used on Desert Island Discs.
Yeah.
Well, that same Doug O'Brien, he sent pieces, and I'll tell you what. I'm not an academic. I write as somebody who's totally in love with Aston Villa.
Yeah.
Doug O'Brien, he loves the Villa no less than me, but the bloke, he is just an encyclopedia of history, of geography. His pieces, if you did a word count, he's probably got more words in that book than I have, but I couldn't leave any out. I just couldn't leave any out.
Fantastic.
And
Peter Fincham as well has got a piece, and Rick Barley. Again, they're members of our Facebook groups, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, I was told the story of a lad called Lawrence Diggins.
Okay.
They went to Berlin in the second round. Just after we'd beaten Valor 7-0 on aggregate, we found ourselves going to the other side of the wall.
Yeah.
And they got to Checkpoint Charlie, this coach load of Villa players, the Villa fans, sorry. And this one lad, they all had to fill in forms on this coach. And Lawrence had put place of birth, hospital. And this armed guard had retrieved all these visa cards, took them off the coach, come back on, and he's sort of getting a bit animated, saying, this isn't what we mean. And at that point, the bus driver put his head down on his arms and went, "Effing hell, we're going to be here for hours." And they were. And then, so I had a few people tell me about this Lawrence Diggins and how they'd christened him Hospital.
Yes, I'm on that page, 222,
Wow.
Lawrence Hospital Diggins.
Yeah. Well, the one night I got a phone call and this lad said, "Can I speak to Colin?" And I said, this was like 11 o'clock at night. I thought, who's phoning me at this time? And it was this Lawrence Diggins. And as soon as he said his name, Lawrence, I went, "Bloody hell, Hospital." And he started laughing. He says, "I haven't heard that for 40 years." And he told me the story. And of course, we had to have him in. Dick Edwards, the old Villa centre half, who was there, in the Doherty's era.
Yep.
Dick Edwards, the lad who played the guitar.
Yep.
He was actually playing a gig in Brussels. And 5 or 6 reporters came in to cover the Villa game. And this was the final. They'd stopped in Belgium on the way through to Holland. They recognised Dick Edwards doing this gig with his former Torquay teammate Bruce Stuckey. They got talking and said, "Come to our hotel and we'll get you tickets for the final." So Dick Edwards, who was an absolute rock in defence for the Villa in his time, he went to the final. John Holder, who, that's a name that you'll recognise. He runs a Lions club now. I sometimes go to games with John now.
Yeah.
John was running Cheltenham Lions back in the day. a friend of his, Alan Brookfield, went with him, and John's youngest brother, I think he was 16-year-old or 15-year-old. His name's Martin. He couldn't go, so John, I don't know how old John was at the time, but John lent his younger brother the money to go to the final. And you think, wow, if John hadn't have done that, that lad would have missed out on, to me, and to all these lads that, who got claret and blue eyes, this was bigger than man walking on the moon.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What a wonderful achievement. Brilliantly put in this. And it isn't the case of they just do one account extract. Hospitals put quite a few in there. The boys are all across it, yeah.
Paul Harvey, he's a friend.
Yeah.
Paul Harvey went to Valor to the away game.
Yeah.
There was, as he's walking into the ground, there's two packages of newspapers, and he took one and put it back on the bus. And his wife Heather was saying that he basically had 200 programs, and I think he's still selling them to this day.
And that's what I love. It's an account of the various games, rounds, and the fans' memories of each and every round, including the final, isn't it? It's absolutely brilliant.
Alan Wilson, great lad. He actually got one of Kenny Swain's socks.
Oh, right, left or right?
Yeah, yeah. He got one of Kenny Swain's socks, and Tony Parton. A really, really good friend of mine, Tony Parton. He's not in the best of health at the minute.
Oh dear. Yeah.
He lives in America. He's had a few surgeries on his head.
Mm-hmm.
Tony's father, Reg, he used to be in charge of the press box at Villa Park in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So Tony was the surname Parton was a name that was recognisable to me from years and years ago. Now, I got to meet Tony when I was doing the research for Encounters of the Third Kind, and I was able to go and interview our reserve team coach from the third division days, a gentleman by the name of Leo Crowther.
Right.
Lovely bloke. He was the reserve team coach when Vic Crow and Ron Wiley looked after first team affairs,
Yeah.
And then you had Frank Upton, who was like the fourth in the pyramid. And it was him that got the Villa to FA Youth Cup winners against Liverpool in '72.
Absolutely, and he changed Brian Little's position to an inside forward.
That's right. But Leo, I went to interview Leo. He had a beautiful house in these grounds, and the main house, it was like something that you would, you need a lottery up to get something like that. And Leo took me into this house. I didn't know who lived it. Well, he said it was his daughter's house.
Right.
I didn't know that his daughter Maureen had married this Tony Parton. Very, very successful bloke.
Right.
But I'm in the house. Leo's shown me all these wonderful one-off things of Aston Villa in this house. And then this bloke appeared, and he's like, he didn't say it, but he's probably thinking, what the hell's this? and I felt a bit uncomfortable, and I'm thinking he's going to take Leo's head off here. And I wittered something about I write books on Aston Villa or something lame, but me and Tony became great friends, and he's one of very, very few people. He's actually got every single bound volume of Aston Villa, and I don't think there's many people on this planet that have them.
Unbelievable accounts. And finally, chapter 6, the Super Cup. So it's not just winning the European Cup and accounts of winning the European Cup. It's there's a chapter of when Aston Villa won the Super Cup, and there's a lovely picture in there of Tony Barton celebrating with Villa coach, and sadly no longer with us, Roy McLaren. So
that's right.
Rest in peace to Roy. Another Holt Ember in the sky, sir.
Well, that only went in because I was working on a farm, and I was actually trying to sell my Ford Capri to finance going to Tokyo, because no way on earth did I want to miss out on watching Aston Villa become the best club side in the world.
Yes.
Unfortunately, they didn't do it, and unfortunately, I didn't sell my car. Nowadays, a Capri would be called a classic. Believe me, it wasn't a classic in them
That
days.
wasn't, was that?
And I couldn't sell it in time. I had to have surgery on an accident that I sustained on the farm, so I probably wouldn't have been able to travel to Tokyo anyway. I did make do with going to see the Villa. The Villa played Arsenal on the Tuesday night. The game brought forward from the Saturday with the Villa going to Tokyo.
Yeah.
And what I did find out, the Villa were actually paid £40,000 for taking part in the World Club Championships.
Okay.
It's not a lot when you think about it, when you think what these players are on now. Now, with the Villa playing Arsenal on the Tuesday night, Arsenal had said to Aston Villa, if we played you on the Saturday, we'd get 25,000.
Yeah.
So anything under 25,000, you're going to compensate to us.
Mm.
Now, the crowd was 17,000 something, and it actually cost the Villa £20,000 for having that game played
give us 60
on the
grand.
Tuesday.
Yeah.
So you got 20 grand for going to Tokyo instead of 40. And I think the players shared some of that out.
Unbelievable. Some brilliant encounters there. And the Villa Roll of Honour. And just before that, on page 252, a wonderful picture. Book author Colin Abbott with Dennis Mortimer at Villa Park, and the picture there of Dennis and Tony. And what a brilliant book. You must be so very proud of yourself, Cole, and your wonderful football club. And we will meet up again and do another podcast talking about your books going forward. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honour.
Thanks, Paul.
Talking about your wonderful books, Bartons Army and the Aston Villa, the big book of the 80s alongside the 70s and the first 150 years. You and David Lane, a match made in heaven, sir. Thank you very much. And
thanks very much, Paul. Sorry for not giving you time to talk.
God
Take
bless.
care, Paul.
Thanks, pal. Bye for now.
Ta-ra.
Bye-bye.